Hey y'all, hey, it is me, Just Allie, your podcast host, and welcome to season 3 of The World According to Allie Viewpoint, where you get to hear my viewpoint and opinions on a variety of topics. If you are not following me on my social media, you can find me on Twitter at Just Allie, Instagram at I am Just Allie, and TikTok, I am Just Allie. And yes, I said TikTok. That is probably where I'm the most active and where I'm having so much fun right now. So head on over to TikTok. Season 2 was all about owning your personal power, and we spent the year becoming more grounded, capable, organized, successful, confident, and hopefully happy. There were episodes on knowing yourself, ambition, developing micro habits, mental fortitude, growth mindset, stress management, befriending your shadows, imposter syndrome, conflict resolution, healthy optimism, laughter, and finally, our last episode was on joy. As I start season 3, I'm still focusing on owning personal power, but I'm doing it a little differently. I think the focus of this season is going to be on history. And I say I think because I may bring in other topics accordingly. But right now, I think the focus is on history and specifically learning the African American history that I have not been taught in school. Because history and knowing who I am and where I come from is part of owning my personal power. So, you know how we do. Before I get into the topic, let's hear a word from our sponsor.
Hey y'all, have you heard about Anchor? It is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other outlets. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. It's what I use, and let me tell you, it is easy and convenient. Download the Anchor app for free or go to Anchor FM to get started. That's ANCHOR.FM.
So, if you are thinking about starting a podcast, have a podcast idea in mind, you should go ahead and get that Anchor app. Now, I'm sure you've noticed whenever you complete an application for a job or for anything, they ask for demographic information. There are currently only 5 categories on race, and they are American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, or white. And then when it comes to ethnicity, it's even more limiting. It's either are you Hispanic or not? So when did race become so narrowly defined? When did it become black or white? Now, I know you've heard the saying race is a social construct, and it is, specifically a social construct used to keep white supremacy in place. So let's get into it. David Rogier said, and I'm sure that I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he said, the world got along without race for the overwhelming majority of history, but the US has never been without it. Before the 1500s, race wasn't a thing. The racial identity of white has evolved throughout history. Initially, it referred to only Anglo Saxon people. Historically, who belonged to that category of white would expand as people wanted to push back against the increasing number of people of color. And I'm talking about in America specifically. Sometime around 1613, when the English first encountered East Indians, through colonization, of course, is when the word first started, but it was only used to describe the skin tone of the elite Anglo-Saxon women because it delineated high class and social status, because their porcelain white skin showed that they did not have to labor outside of the house. It was really a class delineation for women only at that time, because men, even men of high class, had to leave the house to work, and therefore their skin would darken with the sun or redden with the sun. Before the mid 1600s or so, labor in America, or the colonies, because it wasn't America yet, was a combination of indentured servitude and African slaves. Servitude was not hereditary, and there was a possibility of freedom at the end of the contract. So when you hear white people say the Irish were slaves too, they're correct, but it's not the same. And they are saying that usually to invalidate your history. So fuck those people. But I digress. Africans and white indentured servants worked and socialized alongside each other. But after the mid 1600s, things changed. First, in 1662 or around that time, Virginia enacted a law of hereditary slavery, which meant the status of the mother determined the status of the child. And this deviated from English common law, which assigned the legal status of the child based on the father's legal status. Thus, the children of enslaved women would automatically be slaves. Laws were also created to prohibit the interaction between white servants and black slaves. Third, indentured servitude was becoming no longer profitable because there was a cost of passage. It was the planters were paying for the indentured servants to be able to travel from Europe over to the colonies. And at the end of their contract, they would be promised land. So these laborers would work 3 to 10 years, and at the end of the time, they were promised some land and some tools. The planters or plantation owners kind of counted on the indentured servants not surviving their contract. In other words, they hoped that they would die so that they didn't have to give them the land or tools. And this would actually happen quite often because the indentured servants weren't used to the climate or also the different type of like illnesses and viruses that they would encounter. Additionally, the African people were seen as more desirable slaves because they brought more advanced farming skills, carpentry, bricklaying, as well as metal and leatherwork skills. But once again, I digress. As more and more of the indentured servants survived their contracts, the planters or plantation owners did not want to make good on the promise of land. But Allie, what does this have to do with race being black or white? Don't worry, I'm getting into it. You know, I like to always do like a little bit of history and research. So, as servants finished up their indenturedness, I don't know the word. Um, they didn't get the land that they were promised, and they had to continue working for the planters. So in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, who was an indentured servant, who finished up his contract, survived his contract, gets a militia of indentured servants and African slaves, and they rebel. Additionally, they rebelled and started attacking Native Americans because they wanted the land. The governor at the time, who was William Barclay, told them to stop, wanted them to stop, didn't want any beef with the Native Americans. And so Nathaniel Bacon and his militia set Jamestown on fire, the capital of Virginia at the time, set it on fire, and they ran William Berkeley out of town. This turned the tide. So now, with the new laws and societal norms that linked Africans to perpetual labor, the American colonies made the formal distinction based on its people's appearance, place of origin, and hereditary status. Skin color. marked the newly created subordinate position for Africans. And then to further separate the social and legal connections between lower class white people and African laborers, those laws that were put into place to limit interaction started to be enforced. And this created the hierarchy based on race in America. Now, to continue justifying slavery and the horrors of slavery, because how could good Christians treat other human beings this way? A pseudoscience emerged to justify this treatment of slaves, and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences of race. So it was skin tone, the size of your nose, the width of your jaw, the texture of your hair. All of these things in this pseudoscience made you less of a human because you were not Anglo-Saxon and you didn't have those Anglo-Saxon features, and this pseudoscience was used to justify the treatment of slaves. Ironically, America, who would come to be defined by the language of freedom, is also defined by the acceptance of slavery. So this was the start of black and white in America, but it isn't what solidified it into what we now know as black and white race in America. At the time, whiteness was mostly Anglo-Saxon Europeans, and other white ethnic categories were separate. They were defined by the Slavs or the Hebrews or the Celtics. But in the 1920s, there was an increase in immigration of people of color to America. And so all of these other categories of white or other categories of white skin that were not considered white were absorbed into whiteness to ensure the cultural majority. So, this is why we have the social construct of race as we know it now. And like a virus, America has infected the world with this perception of white skin being superior. And the closer you are to white skin being superior, that pseudoscience is still kind of out in the lexicon of the world. You can discover it. And there are people that still, unfortunately, believe that BS. Anyway, I'm going to leave this right here. But coming the rest of the year, I really want to try to learn about the history that we are not taught in school. Anyway, that's it. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like this episode, you can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, on Apple, anywhere podcasts are found. You can also donate to the podcast, Cash App and Venmo. It's I am just Allie, or you can show your support directly on anchor.fm.